Hello everyone. Today we are going to be talking about transportation of nutrients in vascular plants. We have a few learning goals for this lesson. Largely, they are to be able to explain how water can get from the roots into the stems and then to the leaves, and to be able to explain how sugars are able to move around the plant. So, if you recall, vascular tissue is responsible for the transportation of materials around the plant. We have two types. We have xylem and we have phloem. Together, these two tissues will transport water, dissolved substances, and sugars. What you can see here is a plant. Just a quick check-in. By looking at it, can you tell whether it is a dicot or a monocot? So pause the video, and if you need to, check your notes. Okay, hopefully you pause the video. By looking at it, you should be able to tell that it's actually a dicot. And remember, you might run into the term eudicot, which is technically the more appropriate term. So it is a dicot, and you can tell that for various reasons. The first is that at the roots, our xylem is creating that cross shape. At the stem, our vascular bundles, so our xylem and phloem, are arranged in a ring instead of sporadically sort of scattered all over. And the leaf is a little bit less obvious, at least from the cross-section, but there's a few things that sort of indicate it's a dicot, given that there's that central large main vein, and there's presence of a palisade. Remember, those are the column cells that photosynthesize, and the spongy mesophyll. If you were to look, you would expect to see those stoma just on the bottom. The more obvious indication that it's a dicot based on the leaves is the shape of the leaf and how the veins in the leaf create this sort of net-like structure instead of parallel veins. Anywho, that's just a review from one of our first lessons. So now to focus in on our tissues. Like I said, we have xylem, and xylem's main purpose is to transport water, but dissolved nutrients are also going to be coming with it. Phloem, on the other hand, its main purpose is to transport sugars, and as a result of that, we also get some movement of water, but it's not as big of a focus. So that is absolutely something you're going to need to know. Xylem transports water, phloem transports sugar. Here's a piece of terminology that may or may not be new to you. It's turgor, or turgor pressure. Turgor pressure is basically the pressure exerted on the walls of a cell. So here we have our little cell, and plants have cell walls, if you recall. And so turgor is just the pressure that water puts on the cell. And so when there is turgor pressure, or high turgor pressure, the cell is going to be very full. And this is important because it helps support the cell and overall the plant. When there is low turgor pressure, you're actually going to see wilting, and that's when the plant, is looking all sad and deflated, wilting. And it's basically because the plant doesn't have enough water, and so there's no turgor pressure in the cells, so it wilts. So turgor pressure is just water pushing against the cell walls. Another important thing to know is that there's different ways of transporting molecules in and out of cells. So if we have a cell here, right here, and this is the inside over here, inside, then we want to be able to bring stuff to the inside of the cell. And there's generally two ways of doing this. The first is active transport. We call it active because it requires energy. It requires ATP. So active transport requires energy. And passive transport does not require any energy. That's why it's passive. Two types of passive transport are osmosis and diffusion, two terms that you're probably familiar with. In case you need a refresher on what diffusion and osmosis is, here it is. Diffusion is the movement of solute from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And solute is just another word for molecule. So what you see down here is high concentration of this molecule. There's lots of green things in this little space. And what's going to happen is these green molecules are going to spread out into areas of low concentration or empty space. Well, not really empty, but empty of this specific molecule. And I always use the analogy of, well, it's a real life example. If one person in the back of the class farts, then the smell of the fart is going to slowly move towards the front of the class. And that's just like what these molecules are doing. So they're moving from an area of high concentration around the farter to areas of low concentration towards people who, didn't fart. Now, osmosis is a little bit more complicated than diffusion. For one thing, it involves the movement of water across a membrane. So here in these images, we have a membrane here, and we would call it a semi-permeable membrane. So it lets water through, but not everything. And what you can see is on the left, we have two different types of molecule. The black dots are water molecules, and the white dots are sugar molecules. And on the right-hand side, we have all water. So what you can see is this has way more sugar than this. So what's going to happen is the water is going to flow towards the sugar because comparatively, there is a lower concentration of water here than there is here. So this is 100% water, and this is, say, 50% water. So it's going to go towards the area where there's less relative water. And what this ends up doing, if you check out this next panel, is that we end up with sort of an equilibrium or a balance. Now, osmosis, as well as diffusion, is really important, or these two concepts are really important for understanding why water is moving into and around the plant. So the first portion of transport that we're going to talk about is the transport of water. Now, I mentioned earlier, water is going to be transported in which tissue? Is it going to be the xylem or the phloem? If you need to, pause the video and figure it out. Now, hopefully, you were able to say that it's going to travel in the xylem. And this transport of water and nutrients is going to happen in 3 stages. The first stage is going to be from the soil into the roots. The next stage is going to be from the roots and up the stems. And then it's going to be from the stems and into the leaves, as well as, out. So we're going to get into each of those steps in detail. Okay, so on this slide, we are going to be focusing on how water will move from the soil and into the roots. So we're moving from the soil into the roots because that's ultimately where the water comes from. Water is going to be entering the roots via osmosis. Remember, we just finished talking about that. And so water is going to be forced to enter the roots because there's a lot of sugars and molecules in the roots that don't really exist in the soil. And so that draws the water via osmosis into the roots, which is very good. That's what the plant wants. Nutrients, on the other hand, are drawn into the roots via active transport. And the reason for that is there's a lot of nutrients already in the cells. There's a lot of molecules already in the cells. And so you need to put a little bit of energy to force those nutrients into the cells. And so all of this is going to be happening primarily at the root hair cells. So you can see that I've highlighted that in red, or boxed it in red. And these root hair cells are really important because they help to increase the surface area of the roots, which means we have more surface area for water and nutrients to enter. Once actually inside, this water is going to move through the cells and go towards the vascular bundle, or in this case, specifically the xylem vessels or the xylem cells. And then we can move on to the stem. So the water and nutrients that enter the xylem are called the xylem sap. Not too hard to remember because, trees have sap, so this is the xylem sap. And this xylem sap is going to actually move up against gravity, which is crazy because it's moving against gravity just by itself. And it's going to do this through a number of different mechanisms that are related to sort of the physics and chemistry of the molecules and the structures involved. And so we're going to call this the transpiration, cohesion, tension mechanism. And I'm going to get into what all of this even means, because right now it's just a jumble of words that you probably don't understand yet. Now, take a look at this, the word transpiration, cohesion, tension. Are any of these words remotely familiar to you? Because you might have run into them in the past, particularly transpiration. See if you can remember what any of these words mean. If you need to, pause the video. Otherwise, we're going to move on and we'll get into it. So, the question is, how? How is this xylem sap, or water, moving up against gravity? Like I said, there's a few different things involved here. So one of the first things involved is called root pressure. So the best way I can explain root pressure is, so what I've drawn here is a root hair over here. Yep, that's what that looks like, a root hair. And towards the center of the root, I've drawn a xylem cell. And so what's happening is we get water coming into the root hair and moving into the xylem. And if this water is filling that cell, eventually it's going to create a lot of pressure at this area, forcing the water to actually move up. So this is sort of the first component, helping the water to move up against gravity. The second is capillary action. Now, liquids have this really cool property where they tend to move up a tube. And so what you can see here is a wide tube and a narrow tube, and the narrow tube has water at a much higher level. And the reason for this is there's a few attractive forces between the molecules. One attractive force is that the water molecules are attracted to each other, and that's called cohesion. And I kind of remember that because, a cohesive unit or a cohesive group is a group that works really well together. And so these water molecules are really attracted to each other, and they kind of stick together, which means where one molecule goes, the other will follow. The other process involved here is called adhesion. And adhesion is just describes how these molecules are actually attracted to the walls of the vessel. So in this image, the walls is whatever, plastic or glass is being created there. But when we're talking about plants, we're talking about the walls of the xylem. And so starting off, we have two components. We have root pressure, sort of forcing the xylem sap upwards. And we also have this capillary action, which involves cohesion water molecules sticking together, and adhesion, water molecules wanting to stick to the walls of the vessel. But that's not quite all. You remember, we also talked about transpiration. Now, transpiration is a word that you may have encountered when talking about the water cycle. Transpiration is basically the process of evaporation of water from plants, specifically out the stomata or stoma. So what you see here is a cross-section of a plant leaf, and they have indicated that water is leaving out the leaf, and so it's transpiring. It actually looks like this leaf is upside down, because if these are the palisade mesophyll and these are the spongy mesophyll, then the stomata should be on the bottom. So this image is flipped. So basically, what's going to happen is water is going to move from the stem. So I've drawn here my little green stem, and these blue lines are the xylem. So that's our vascular tissue xylem. And water is going to move out of the xylem and into the leaves. And so this whole process is driven by this transpiration, because what happens is we have water leaving the leaves, and this causes a low concentration of water. So low water. And whenever there's low water, you're going to be having water running to fill that sort of low concentration of water. And together with that root action at the bottom, so root pressure, and the capillary action forcing water up, and this low concentration, we're going to get water up and out. So just as a summary, we are going to have a few different forces involved here. The first is root pressure, and it's going to be pushing that water up from the bottom. So it's pushing that water up from the bottom. The next is going to be transpiration. So transpiration means water leaving the leaves out of those stomata. And this is really, really important because it pulls the water up. It's creating that concentration difference. This is where the transpiration cohesion tension mechanism gets the name tension, because as water leaves, it causes a negative pressure, and that means that water is trying to fill that negative pressure. And added to that is the capillary action, where we have cohesion, water sticking to water, and adhesion, water sticking to the xylem walls. If we go and draw it out, okay, here's my bad image. So we have our shoots above the soil, our roots below the soil, our leaf. There's probably going to be more than one. And it all starts in the soil. And water is going to enter the root hair by osmosis. You're going to get some water gathering in our xylem. Here, I'll just go ahead and draw our xylem. And that's going to cause root pressure. Due to capillary action, water's going to want to creep up the walls of the xylem. And where one water molecule is going to go, they're all going to go. So they're going to be creeping up the walls. At the same time, we're going to be getting transpiration. So transpiration out the leaves. Oh gosh, it's hard to write without oh goodness. Hard to write without a stylus. Okay, transpiration. So water's going to be leaving. And this causes a negative pressure in this area. And so water's going to want to fill that negative pressure. So once again, forcing that water up and into the leaves. So root pressure at the roots, pushing up. Transpiration at the leaves, pulling up, and capillary action allowing those water molecules to stick together and move up the xylem. Altogether, this is our transpiration, cohesion, tension mechanism in plants. So that was the transport of water and also nutrients from the soil into the leaves. Now we need to talk about the transport of sugars. If before we talked about xylem and water, that means now we're going to be talking about the phloem and sugar. Now, of course, you know, photosynthesis is an important part of what makes plants, survive and all that. They're autotrophs, so they're going to be creating their own sugar. And photosynthesis is going to be happening in any of the plant parts that are green. Usually this is the leaves, but sometimes stems are photosynthetic as well. So that's one way that plants will get sugar. But plants can also store sugar, usually in their roots. And so sugars can be produced by breaking down long carbohydrates into smaller sugars, which means sometimes we have sugars being produced in the roots, and sometimes we have, in the roots, and sometimes we have sugars being produced in the leaves, which means sugars need to be able to move up and down the plant. And this is very different from water, which only needs to move up. When we're talking about sugars, there's going to be a source of sugar and a sink for the sugar. A source is defined as an area with a high concentration of sugars or other solutes. So for example, when a leaf is photosynthesizing, a leaf could be a source of a sugar. A sink is an area with low concentrations of sugars. So those would be cells that maybe aren't photosynthetic but still need sugars. Or perhaps the seeds and fruit of the flower. So that's where sugars are going to be stored for specific purposes. Now, the location of sources and sinks can depend on the time of the year. Why do you think this might be? I would encourage you to think about how places like Canada have different seasons. How do you think that's going to impact a plant's ability to photosynthesize? So like I said, the place of a source and sink is dependent on the time of year. For example, in winter, plants are dormant. At least in the northern hemisphere, they lose their leaves in the autumn, and therefore they're not photosynthesizing. For this reason, those leaves can't possibly be a source. There is no leaves, so there would be no high concentration of sugars in the leaves. In the springtime, a plant is going to be trying to regrow those leaves, and so it's dependent on stored carbohydrates that exist in the roots or the stems. And so in this way, the source changes. In times when the leaves are photosynthesizing, then they're going to be a source. But in times when there is no leaves, then they're likely going to be, they don't exist, so they can't be a source. And instead, the source would be the roots or stems. And the sink is going to also change. So in the early spring, when we're trying to build new leaf tissues, then the sink is going to be those new leaf tissues because it needs carbohydrates in order to create new tissues. Whereas when there is ample photosynthesis happening in the leaves, then the sinks will be other areas of the plant that simply need carbohydrates for energy. So regardless of the time of year and regardless of where the sugars are going, there's a few different steps, just like there was with transport of water. So the first step is from the source to the phloem. Then there's transport in the phloem, and this is called translocation. And then there's transport from the phloem into the sink cells. over here on the right, we have a diagram basically showing the whole process. The first process is from the source and into the phloem. And you'll notice here the source is a green cell. So it's depicting a leaf cell because, well, one, it says it, and also it's green, so we know that it's photosynthesizing. And what's going to happen is the sugar is going to leave the leaf and enter the phloem. And it's going to do this in a process using active transport. So we actually need to expend energy in order to get this sugar out of the source and into the phloem. And what happens is when we have a lot of sugars in this phloem, it's actually going to draw water into the phloem. And you may recall this is the process of osmosis. So we're getting water into the phloem, and this is going to increase the turgor pressure of the phloem cells. Now remember, turgor pressure is just that pressure caused by fluid, in this case water, pushing against the walls of the cell. This turgor pressure is really important for allowing or causing translocation to occur. So translocation is basically just the transport of substances through the phloem. So in this case, we're talking about glucose. So that's translocation. And translocation is driven by this turgor pressure. And it's called the pressure flow model. So basically what happens is you have this high turgor pressure up by the cells up here where we have water moving in and sucrose going in. So this is the source. And we will have slightly lower turgor pressure towards the sink cells because there's less water here. You can see there are fewer little blue dots. And the result is that basically water, this water with sugar, is pushed down towards the sink as a result of this turgor pressure up here by the source and sort of that low concentration down here by the sink. And our final step of movement of sugars in the phloem is moving from the phloem to the sink cells. And because our sinks have a low concentration of sugar, then this allows passive transport to occur. So we do not require energy to store or put glucose into these sink cells. And because sugar, our little red molecules over here, are leaving the phloem, then what you're going to end up with is water going back into the xylem. What this means is that you're going to maintain that turgor difference up here by the source and down here by the sink. And so if you're always maintaining that difference in turgor pressure, then it's going to allow the pressure flow model to keep working. So just as a summary, we looked at how sugar moves from the source to the phloem, and that's through the process of active transport. So we're putting energy into it in order to do that. And as a result of that, we're increasing the turgor pressure of the phloem. We then talked about how sugar moves through the phloem, and that's called translocation. And translocation is driven by that difference in turgor pressure from the source cells to the sink cells. And we called that the pressure flow model. And it's kind of the accepted theory of how that works. And finally, we talked about how sugar is going to move from the phloem and into the sink cells. And that's going to be passive transport, so we don't have to put any energy into it. And then the water from the phloem will move back into the xylem, and that maintains that turgor pressure difference between the source cells and the sink cells. And that is it for today's lesson on transport in vascular plants. We looked at movement of water in the xylem and movement of sugar in the phloem. We looked at how water can move from the roots to the stem to the leaves, and the processes that drive that, including things like capillary action, adhesion, cohesion, tension, and transpiration. And we looked at how sugars will move from source cells, sometimes leaves, sometimes not, depending on the season, into sink cells, and the mechanisms with which it does that through that difference in turgor pressure in the phloem. And this lesson was really kind of physics, chemistry heavy with all those driving forces, like the pressure and the concentration differences. So as always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and good luck.